Hello, welcome back to the final part of the lecture. So where we left it is that student fees had been created by the Labour government under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown at £1,000 a year in 1998. But 5 years later, in 2003, the Labour government came back and increased those fees 3 times, from £1,000 to £3,000 a year. And that vote passed the House of Commons by 5 votes, 316, 311. And this at a time when the Labour government actually had a majority of 161. So obviously a huge number of Labour MPs at the time opposed the increase from 1,000 to 3,000. Many did so because they felt that this substantial increase from what was a reasonable sum, but still at a much lower level than the cost of providing a degree, of course, was a very significant step in the wrong direction in reducing potentially access from different parts of society to university education. Now, in truth, what's happened since doesn't necessarily bear that concern out. But politically at the time, it was certainly a hugely controversial and difficult time for the government, who, as I say, saw their majority slashed from 161 to just 5. At the time, of course, it was still assumed in all the calculations that were being done that most people, most students, would in due course, when they got jobs, pay most of the loans back. That's no longer the case, as we'll see in a moment. So in looking at student fees and how they evolved over the 20 years of various increases, policy motivations, I think, were very different. The Labour governments initially wanted to prove themselves fiscally responsible, as we've reflected, to deliver big increases in university access, particularly into what would have been called the working class, and to increase the numbers going to university, with the aim that was set originally by Blair of 50% of students. By contrast, university education in Germany was free, remained free as it had been in effect for England, but only 27% of 18-year-olds went into university education. There is, of course, a much higher tradition of technical education in Germany. But this reflects the social policy debates that the government had to square. If you wanted 50% of 18-year-olds to go to university, the cost of providing that access, the cost of the fees and so on, meant that you had to look for ways of funding it outside of general taxation. The coalition government, which followed in 2010, had rather different views, aiming at different social policy goals. They were very much concerned that the state of the nation's finances meant austerity, reductions in public spending were necessary. They wanted also to introduce competition between universities more explicitly than governments had done up to then. So in what's called the Brown Report on Higher Education and Student Funding in 2010, they recommended further fee increases, living cost loans rather than any form of grants, but not having any upfront cost when students first went to university. And the coalition government chose £9,000 a year, another tripling. So in a very short order, in only 7 or 8 years, fees had gone from £1,000 to £3,000 to £9,000 a year. And as I said, £1,000 a year may seem a lot of money at the time, but £9,000 is a huge amount. However, the government of the day also expected, and it was explicit in the way they discussed it, that there would be different fees for different courses and different universities. Something, of course, that has essentially never happened. But the understanding was that in setting a maximum student fee of £9,000 a year, that's what one would pay for studying social policy or engineering at Bath. But if you were studying a lower level degree at what might be considered a lower level university, that might be £5,000 or £6,000 a year. And there would be competition between courses and subjects in universities with a range of different fees on offer. And as I say, essentially that has never happened. Every university has charged every course in every subject at the maximum available. The increase to £9,000 then was justified largely by reference to higher lifetime earnings of graduates, and people were encouraged to see it as an investment, not just a cost. Now, it is true that for many people in a number of courses and subjects and degrees, there is a higher lifetime earnings that people may well achieve, but it is not by any means universal to everyone, it's not universal to every subject, and it's not universal to every university. I just wanted very briefly to say that we've largely been talking about England, and the position in Scotland and Wales was different and has changed markedly since devolution. No fees for under 25s in Scotland, no fees for Scottish students. Grants of up to £5,200 towards fees in Wales. Although one should note, of course, that Scotland itself receives additional central funding from the UK at taxpayer levels higher than in England under what's called the Barnett formula. So there is an argument that those who are able to attend as Scottish students in Scotland are getting a much cheaper university education because taxpayers in England are paying more money to the Scottish government. But where are we now? The total outstanding debts of student fees is over £100 billion. The last time the loans were sold by the government to the private sector, which is what they do, it was sold at only 50% of face value. In other words, that half the student loans which were outstanding would never be paid back. The Treasury estimated for students starting university in 2017-18, only 38% of student loans would ever be repaid, and that number continues to fall. Access remains a very mixed picture. For black and minority ethnic students at Russell Group universities, access is not great. For white working class boys at all universities, access is not as good as it might be. For those who've had free school meals from all forms of walks of life and backgrounds, university numbers remain low. And there is very little political consensus on what the next steps might be to tackle any of these issues or what might be considered a priority. I mentioned earlier the Robbins report in the Augar Review that was commissioned by Theresa May and reported later to Boris Johnson's government. And if you remember, the focus in Robbins was instructions in skills, general powers of mind, research and common citizenship. And the Augar Review also had 4 key focuses, but only one of them really reflects the Robbins 4, and that is skills provision. The Augar Review was asked to look into how to improve and increase competition and choice for young people among universities and courses. It was asked to look at how to promote access for all, and it was asked to look at value for money in degrees and fees. And this reflects in the 50 or so years between Robbins and Augar a very different view of the social policy objectives that the government is trying to achieve through university education. So some of the issues we might want to reflect upon, you might want to think about, as I said at the beginning as the final part of our talk, is what would you do? What would be your priorities if you were trying to sort out student fees and access to university? Who pays what and in what proportion? Is it right to change from the current 53% or so that university budgets receive from fees? Should that be lower with lower fees, or should it be higher with an increase in fees? Can you reduce the costs of a university degree? There's been a lot of talk, for example, of moving to 2-year degrees in some places and for some subjects. Can you achieve real competition in a market and drive differentiated fees? Will the universities cooperate? And actually, is that a good thing? Do you want universities competing for students not just on quality or range of courses, but actually on how much it will cost them? What about groups, individuals who are still not getting fair access or enough access to university courses? What would be your priorities in that? And how would you fund the work or the financial underpinning that's necessary to bring more people from those groups who are still not benefiting from this great increase in university places to achieve something more of equality? And what do you think is politically acceptable, and what indeed might be politically advantageous? What might be the way of increasing support for the policies you're putting forward? If you are advising the Secretary of State for Education, or indeed the Shadow Secretary of State, what ideas would you be putting to them for the future of university education? And what's happened recently is that Parliament has allowed universities to offer 2-year degrees with a fee of up to £11,000 a year. But many students want placement, work experience, travel, so actually 4-year degrees are becoming much more the norm rather than reducing to 2. And actually the cost of delivering a university degree vary greatly. It costs perhaps £7,500 to deliver humanities and social science degrees, but £22,000 to deliver veterinary science. but both would probably be paying the same fees at the same university. Many universities have invested hugely in their campuses, in accommodation, new buildings. Is it possible that in the next 10 years or so that will scale back, reducing the costs to the university and perhaps reducing the costs to individual students? And in the Augar review, there was a recommendation indeed to reduce fees to $7,500 a year, to review the fees for different subjects, to promote what they called socially desirable professions, to reduce the interest rates, which are very large on student debt, but to extend the period of repayment from 30 to 40 years, effectively your whole working life. They did, however, suggest bringing back maintenance grants for the disadvantaged. So the Augar review set out, in some ways, quite a different view from where we are: lower overall fees, more encouragement for having fees differentiated across different subjects, some lower interest rates, but paying back the debt over a longer period. And just last month, the government responded to the Augar review, or at least they issued a response to some of the proposals. There were no decisions on the level of fees, no decisions on interest rates, and really no decisions on access. There was much more of a focus on technical skills and non-university post-teen education and training. There was a recognition that the COVID pandemic and remote learning has led to a lot of pressure for fee refunds or other recognition of the impacts on all of you, on all students. But there are no real suggestions that the government plans to respond positively, or at least no suggestions yet that they might be responding positively to the sort of ways in which the last year or more of your university education and many, many students' university education has been changed so radically. So, as I say, what would you do? If you were advising the politicians, where would you spend the money you might have to change the way university education worked? How would you maintain university budgets if fees for individual students were reduced? And if you didn't support those budgets, what would happen to teaching quality? How many students from which different backgrounds in society did you want to access which courses at universities? Do you want to subsidise the courses which we need, say medicine or engineering, or do you want to use the money to subsidise people from disadvantaged backgrounds to come to universities? How far do we want to manage places at Oxbridge, Bath and other top universities? How far do we want to intervene in the individual decisions those universities take around admissions? And in the end, the fundamental question, which is what the story of today has all been about really, how many people should go to university? Is there a right number? Should we revert to Robbins that everyone who has the ability and has attained the level to benefit from university should be allowed to go? Does that mean fees, more fees, lower fees? Could somehow the taxpayer be expected to pick up more of the bill in the future? The point I want to leave you with really is that, like many social policy issues, designing the financial and admissions structures for university education is fraught with difficulty. Wherever you come from on the political spectrum and whatever your objectives are, the one thing you can be sure of, there's precious few easy answers. Thanks very much.